our viewers and listeners for the first ever series of our She Leads webinar. Thank you so much to our speakers who have joined us today. The She Leads project is a multi-country project in South and Central Asia that addresses the issues related to TFGBV. And we are here today to increase awareness on these issues and to be able to tackle the different forms, manifestations, and platforms that in which these issues occur. And joining us today are our speakers, resource speakers from IREX. We have Rachel Bowen and Judy Karyoko. Rachel Bowen is the technical advisor for technology-facilitated gender-based violence. She leads the global technical activities for the Transform activity and provides guidance on addressing TFGBV in programs and proposals across IREX. Rachel has worked and conducted research in Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Panama for more than 20 years, with focus on gender-based violence, human rights enforcement, anti-corruption, and rule of law promotion. Rachel has also led and evaluated an 18-month cohort program to prepare rising institutional leaders with an emphasis on women and minoritized groups. She managed and evaluated a training of trainers program to engage male allies for women's advancement. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We also have Judy Karyoko, who is the Senior Program Officer at IREX and is based in Nairobi, Kenya. She currently leads the in-country implementation of USAID's Transform Digital Spaces program aimed at redressing the technology-facilitated gender-based violence impacting women in politics and public life. Judy has over 5 years of experience in various gender and development projects across Kenya and Somalia. She has technical expertise in project and grants management, deploying survivor-centered approaches to address violence against women and girls, and advancing gender equality and social inclusion. Judy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure.
And I'm Christine Sumugoy. I'm managing the She Leads project. I'm also joined by Darini. Darini, would you like to also introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. This is Dharni, and I'm the lead advisor for She Leads on gender and digital peace building. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much. So, Darini, so today is just really to have this opportunity to speak with our guests. TFGBV is an issue that's prevalent nowadays. It's an evolving form of GBV. What do you think about this issue, Darini?
I think, especially from the South and Central Asian content, we kind of think people talk about it more ever since COVID, right? It's becoming a real priority with digital education and, remote work. But as you said, Christine, TFGBV is an extension of GBV, and it's been there for a long time. And it's very important that people understand that. And I think people are starting to understand that, it's just offline violence that is happening in digital platforms. And I really appreciate our speakers here and the work that they're doing. Because what we want to do is make people feel safe and included online without demonizing technology, which is what happens a lot when you talk about the FGBV. So I'm really glad that we're doing this. And we are working with and talking to people across the world who are also, taking part in this conversation. So, yeah.
Thank you, Darini. So, Rachel and Judy, would you like to talk about the project in which you actually address these issues of TFGBV?
Yeah, so I also just want to echo Zarini's comment about not demonizing technology. Without technology, we couldn't be having this conversation across the globe, and that's really wonderful to be able to do. So Transform is a 3-year global pilot program funded by USAID We're working in multiple countries, including Kenya, where Judy is based, and Guatemala, where I'll be headed shortly, actually. We're a pilot program. We're working with local organizations to support their innovative projects to try to address TFGBV. We focus on TFGBV, technology-facilitated gender-based violence, as it affects women in politics and public life. But we're quite aware that it affects all kinds of women all across all parts of society, that it's, as you say, a type of violence against women, a type of GBV. It's also a type of violence against women in politics, which is a central concern of ours. And as a global pilot, one of our big goals is really to learn from all of what our innovation grantees are doing, all of our interactions. So it's great to be able to have the opportunity to learn from you all as well.
So through the Transform project, like who are the target groups that you aim to impact through this initiative? You talked about women in public facing roles, but then you also go beyond that. So, and you've talked about the innovation grantees. So who are the target groups so far, as far as the implementation?
Yeah, the people who we work directly with are primarily local civil society organizations. So we work to fund civil society organizations to engage in innovations that should help women in politics and public life and prevent, respond to, and mitigate TFGBV. And so when we talk about women in politics and public life, we pretty much view, right? So obviously that includes, women candidates, women in parliaments, women in government offices, but we also include journalists, activists, human rights defenders. In some countries, we find that public school teachers become significant people, women in public life. It varies a bit who all necessarily counts as a woman in public life by context, but that is our primary focus. We also are doing a pretty extensive capacity building program with CSOs, not limited to the ones that we're funding. So it's a much broader capacity building portfolio. And I think Judy can probably comment to the breadth of people who've been involved in Kenya. So.
Absolutely, Rachel. Thank you so much for that. And some of the other stakeholders who we have been engaging in the Transform program include duty bearers who entail government officials or government agencies who are mandated to address online violence or also protection and also provide access to justice, so TFGBV. So we have quite a broad range of actors that we have been engaging across our implementing countries. And aside from the government, we have also been engaging tech sector and civil society, not only civil society, but those working in the civic tech space to ensure that we are having inclusive and multi-sectoral approaches to addressing tech-facilitated gender-based violence, which has multifaceted engagements that require multifaceted approaches. So essentially, Transform program has not been limited to the stakeholders that we engage through our initiatives, and we provide an opportunity to ensure that we are having as much cross-sectoral collaboration as possible. That is why we engage not only survivors, but also across the spectrum, stakeholders who are involved in the digital space. Thank you for that.
We also, yeah, thank you, Judy. That reminded me that I would like to share that we feel very strongly that the solution shouldn't be on the shoulders of the survivors and on the women's organizations, right? So often with GBV, it becomes a task for women's organizations to solve and not a task for all of society to solve. And so we really want to have everyone involved in creating solutions to TFGBV.
We actually agree with you on that, Rachel, because for the She Leads project, we also aim for this to be women-led, but also multi-sectoral collaboration. Right now, we also do mobilize a community of digital stewards who are online administrators across different social media spaces in Pakistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. And our aim is for them to collaborate with the government, the tech companies, private sector, and academia and all other sectors, so that everyone can actually work together to promote digital safety, to promote um, safe access to digital tools. And I'm also hearing from both of you, Rachel and Judy, that you work with local CSOs. And one of the issues related to TFGBV is localization. Sometimes we use this terminology, but what is the do local organizations understand TFGBV in its international definition, or how do they look at it in their and apply it in their own local context? Like, what is the local understanding of the CSOs and the local communities on TFGBV?
Thank you, Christine. I think locally across board, we have observed that TFGBV has many dimensions and it manifests in different forms across the different contexts that we are piloting the Transform initiative. And in as much as we have the internationally available definitions, you will find that TFGBV is prevalent across board, although it may not align specifically to one form, but the multifaceted forms that it appears. So we have seen that the local communities, as much as they're aware it exists, there's still a gap in terms of actually contextualizing what it is and the various forms that it is. And that's why programs on TFGBV are relevant to enhance awareness, not only on the actual harm, or also the actual vice itself and how transference of the crime online and offline is happening. So different contexts have different interpretations of TFGBV. Some may not even be aware of the technical term itself, but they have other forms of TFGBV. Among the various myriad of ways that it manifests, they have either familiarity or have experienced or even encountered TFGBV. So they may be aware, but the contextualizing of TFGBV in itself as a concept or even in law has not been something that we have observed across board. And there's also some sort of gap in terms of also awareness by not only CSOs, but also duty bearers who may or may not have a full understanding of what it entails. And we're also finding some gaps in terms of awareness on how or who should an individual or a survivor go to in terms of addressing TFGBV or even getting support and redress mechanisms. So it really varies in terms of manifestation and the forms, and also the understanding among the communities and also the duty bearers on board. Thank you.
And actually, when we also look at these international definitions, right, like in our literature, there are so many of these international sources and different organizations that are also defining TFGBV differently. But one of the common things is the fact that this is GBV that's amplified by technology. I think that's one of the common factors in terms of defining this. And then also the human aspect, the human factors that contribute to TFGBV. So I think for us, Derini, I guess in like the South and Central Asia context, we actually look at the human factors and the technological factors as maybe a way to actually localize that understanding, because they look differently across different countries.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. We agree. It's TFGBV is a human problem, just like any kind of violence against women, GBV, violence against women in politics. It's something being done by humans, and it's amplified by technology, right? So some of our task, I think, and probably yours as well, is to help people understand that what is happening online is also has impact offline. And often, of course, online violence leads to or includes or is part of a broader circumstance of offline violence. And that's true for women in politics, and it's true for women generally. But we can't, well, let me put this differently. There are tech solutions that can really help.
Yes.
There are roles for the tech companies, and there are roles for having good technology. But the core of the problem is human behavior.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something there because we're talking about humans and also culture. So, I was doing a workshop on TFGBV and we were talking about different manifestations of it. And we started talking about, voyeurism, digital voyeurism, and also in Sri Lanka, there's this very prominent problem called upskirting. And upskirting is when you shoot somebody's a video or a picture up somebody's skirt. And especially in our culture, where women wear a lot of skirts and saris, it's very easy to do in public transport. So I remember we had an incident of upskirting in school, where this boy was using like a little camera to record the girls in the classroom because the uniforms are skirts. And I remember being very disappointed about it. Like, why are, people doing this? And I went home and I complained to my mother saying, this is just awful. And she told me that when she was younger and she was walking to school, my mother is over 60 years old. She was walking to school. The boys in the school would stand next to puddles, rain puddles on rainy days, so that they can see the reflection of the girls walking by the puddles to look up their uniforms. And it made me realize, as we correctly just said, nothing has changed. It's just technology is there and it's just a new mean to violate women and to perpetuate, gender-based violence. So yeah, it's just amplifying it. It is not the source of the problem. The source of the problem is really how we look at and treat women and each other. So yeah.
Thanks for adding to that, Jarini. Um, we also would like to explore about the distinguishing types of TFGBV. What do we think are the key differences between TFGBV manifested in intimate partner violence and domestic violence versus those experienced by women and gender diverse individuals, such as abuse and harassment via social media? How do we think these forms impact the presence and safety of women in leadership roles?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, and it's a very important one, and something that in the Transform program we think about a lot, how to communicate. So the tactics of TFGBV, the forms in that sense, are very, very similar, right? Intimate partners can do cyber stalking, can engage in a sort of non-consensual sharing of, intimate images. People who are known to each other can send each other sexually explicit images or video unrequested, unbidden, unwanted. All of those kinds of things happen in intimate partner circumstances and also happen for women in politics and public life. The big difference that we see is that intimate partner violence is usually about controlling that woman and the people in her direct, sort of circle. Whereas TFGBV against women in politics and public life has a much broader scope. So it may target an individual woman an individual candidate for office, for example, but the goals are much bigger, right? The goals are to silence that woman, also to silence other women, and to silence the kinds of topics that woman is talking about. So TFGBV against women in politics and public life also targets those ideas, and often those ideas are around women's rights, and also in many cases around democracy and human rights. So that's the big difference that we see. And with TFGBV against women in politics and public life, we also see impacts on women and girls and gender diverse individuals who witness it. It's referred to as the chilling effect, where women and girls and gender diverse individuals who witness TFGBV in public against, particularly around ideas and policy and sort of social concerns, often themselves withdraw from sharing their opinions about those things and online. and sometimes offline as well. But so that impact is very different, which is not to diminish the impact of intimate partner violence, but it's a different sphere.
And in your context or in your project, do you see that women in public facing roles are at higher risks of experiencing TFGBV, or are there other identities that also play a role into them being exposed or vulnerable to abuse?
Yeah, I would say that we see both, and I'm going to let Judy step in on this one. But
Absolutely. I think we see both. And like we discussed earlier, TFGBV itself, like traditional forms of GBV, it is rooted in patriarchy, in our traditional societal norms. So I think one of the key driving factors as to why women in politics and public life are particularly at higher risk of experiencing TFGBV is because, in essence, by being in public-facing roles or even vying for political office, they are challenging some sort of gendered stereotype or even societal norms. And this ensures that they are actually provoking backlash from either those who may feel threatened or those who feel that they are challenging the existing norms. So I think that's one key factor, and hence why the differentiation between TFGBV and ordinary violence, because it will be designed or even meted out against women to ensure that they are either being discredited or altogether censured and not being able to participate in decision-making roles as per some deeply rooted norms. And there are also some key drivers that include they're politically motivated, we would say, because we have seen in instances where since the political discourse has shifted to online, the online space, and social media is one of the contexts where discussions on politics and where aspiring leaders may choose to either share their opinions or even comment on a political discourse. So we have observed that there are some political motivation whereby perpetrators are either incentivized to particularly target women in the public sphere and also the digital space. And the tactics that are employed are usually just sexist remarks or even altogether cyber mobbing, or even poisoning their hashtags or any other issue that may seek, again, to discredit or even undermine women's authority and decisions, or altogether even coerce them to deter themselves or even altogether leave the political discourse or public faces. And altogether, I see also the lack of accountability and awareness or even having strong TFGBV redress mechanisms has left most women, I would say, vulnerable to continued engagement, and women on the front line, including women rights defenders, politicians, journalists, are more often than not more and more vulnerable to online harm, such as TFGBV. So it's quite a pervasive issue with purpose, and it's mostly geared towards discrediting, demeaning, or even delegitimizing the public-facing role or the authority of women altogether. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've also seen that women with intersectional identities also often are highly targeted. So there's research in the US and the UK to indicate that Black women in those contexts are more heavily targeted for TFGBV and harassment online. But also we see similarly in, for example, Guatemala is one of the countries where we're working. We do see Indigenous women or women in politics and public life who come from Indigenous backgrounds who are themselves particularly targeted, and often the narratives with which they're targeted draw on sort of both challenging kind of dominant traditional norms in this society, but also challenging the fact that they are Indigenous, right? So they're harassed both for being women and for their ethnic or cultural religious background. So they get this kind of double or triple kinds of harassing narratives and discrimination that they face online.
And when we actually look at data, it seems to be like we also seem to grapple with understanding how this is impacting women and girls. And so, Darini, do you have any question with regard to data and evidence also?
Yeah, what we've kind of also noticed is that while we agree this is a global problem, there's not a lot of global evidence for it. There's quite a bit of regional data, country level data, but nothing to show the sheer scale of how this is happening all over the world. And even when there is global data, it seems to focus on either a particular platform like Facebook, or it focuses on a particular target group like women in politics. So what do you think about the current gaps in data? What do you think is the focus and the priority? And where do you think it should shift in the future? And what should we focus on as we move on this topic?
Yeah, we absolutely agree. We've seen the same gaps in global data and global evidence. And some regions are more heavily represented than others. And I think this is a result of the fact that it often started being researched in sort of Western or global North countries for various reasons, which might include high levels of digital participation, but that leaves out huge portions of digital participants, right? There are women and girls participating online all over the world and experiencing this. And we definitely see some of the big gaps that we see even among women in politics and public life is there's not a lot of good evidence to understand the challenges faced by women human rights defenders or environmental defenders. There's a lot more evidence about, for example, what women in parliaments face, right? So the Interparliamentary Union has done research on that. But human rights defenders, women rights activists, even content creators online, sort of influencers and those sorts of women are not strongly researched, right? And they're not necessarily defined the same way across the world, even how we think about those categories. And I think that also comes from the fact that we don't yet have a completely agreed upon global definition of what TFGBV is. And many countries, most countries, the vast majority of countries do not have laws that clearly define and prohibit and criminalize TFGBV. And so it's not being reported in ways that get kind of recorded and can be compared globally, right? Homicide or femicide are very relatively easy to keep track of because they get reported, and online violence doesn't necessarily. So the big gaps that I see, or the big priorities that I see, would be, really understanding the scale, understanding how it impacts. Obviously, in Transform, we're focused a lot on women in politics and public life. We're very concerned about the gaps in understanding women human rights defenders. I would add to that I would like to see the agenda focus a lot more on emerging women and girl leadership. We know that there's this chilling effect, but we haven't seen a lot of work or research or programs to try to counteract that chilling effect. And so that's something that, I'd like to see more programs work on. I also think in general, an area that we're missing is the impact that it has on women's economic participation. Right? A huge amount of our economic lives are online now as well, in addition to our political and social lives. And I have not seen a lot of research that clearly kind of tackles that question of when a woman starts a business online, does she become more heavily targeted for TFGBV? I suspect she would, but I don't have that evidence. So
thanks so much, Rick. And absolutely agreed. And I wanted to share, we did a program, or we're doing a program in Sri Lanka with Search Sri Lanka. And we had one specific training cohort where we brought together women already in political office, and then girls who are interested to talk about TFGBV and, what do they see, what do they observe, and then also for women in the office to talk about their experiences. So quite interesting to see those dynamics come together. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned, the economic participation. There is a bit of a misconception that what happens online stays online. Unlike GBV, which has, socioeconomic consequences and emotional consequences, people assume that, if it happens online, you can delete it or you can get off the app and it should be okay. So how or why do you think TFGBV is more normalized or trivialized in our societies? And what do you think are the actual consequences of TFGBV to the, various people who experience it?
Absolutely. Judy, do you want to handle this one?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the main reason as to why TFGBV is viewed the way it is, it's like just like GBV, and we alluded to this earlier, it's seen as a women's problem, or if it happens to you, you either predisposed yourself to online abuse, especially women who are told that being in a public-facing role, it sort of comes with the situation. So there's this misconception, and some people feel that it's not a real threat, or it's not really a threat. So we have observed that in some way it is normalized, because the real impact of the abuse it's not something that you can actually tangible say is this, but in actual sense, the type of harm that is that occurs after being targeted by online harm is quite irreparable. And the fact that it can be normalized or even undermined to be seen as it's not really a problem is one of the reasons as to why it's considered a less negligible issue. And I think another thing that we see is that there's a lot of people and a lot of things that are happening online, and there's this misconception that, and also with the anonymity that comes with the digital space. So there's a perception like what happens online stays online, and what happens offline is now a real manifestation. But we have seen, and we do observe, that sometimes the continuum of violence that is perpetrated online can also translate offline. I would give a case of the recent happenings in the Kenyan contest, where there has been a lot of digital activism and protests coordinated through the digital space. And in as much as they're calling for positive reform, we have seen the matter go to extreme measures where individuals in public-facing roles are actually doxxed, whereby their information is shared online. Their personal information, or even information about their children, their lives, is shared online. And of course, there's a call to violence where they're actually being targeted, and the violence is translating from not only online harassment, but actually physical harm. So it's a continuum that is very, very cognizant of the lives that we live online and offline. And most individuals or perpetrators may rely on the anonymity of the digital space, but then the reflections and how TFGBV is continuously breaking that barrier between online and offline violence is very worrisome, and hence requires very innovative measures to ensure that it is addressed both offline and online. And again, we remember that we shouldn't think of this violence as separate categories like physical violence and offline violence. They're the same forms of violence. It's only that in technology, they're amplified more. We would say that the damage is usually, it has a wider reach, and it has a broader impact on health, psychological impact, as well as also based off of the research conducted by IPU and women journalists, we see that as a result of being harmed online, or TFGBV being meted against women, they have resulted to either, for instance, women journalists not wanting to cover various stories because of the backlash that they will face. We have seen also women in politics, some of them also take a step back on an issue because of the violence or perceived violence that they purport to receive from showing their alignment or opinion about it. So it's a problem that does not need to be differentiated between physical violence and offline violence. Rather, solve and also have more research to show that continuum and how it's really being perpetrated not only online, but also transferred to physical violence.
I think there's also broad impacts on all of us, right, on societies, because all of our social lives are at least overlap with our online lives, right? Online life is real life, and the impacts that happen online happen in real life. And that includes when women are stepping back from participation, that has impacts for democracy, it has impacts for our societies, it has impacts for all of us. So
absolutely. I think something that I've noticed as well when we were talking about research gaps earlier is that there's quite a bit of research on the people who are experiencing it, but not enough on people who are witnessing it. And even though, you know, there might be people who've never experienced TFGBV, we've all seen somebody go through it. So, and the bystander effect is so prominent online because you can witness it and, you know, just stay out of it. So yeah, that's something definitely we should look into when we work on this. I did want to ask, especially considering that Judy and Rachel, both of you work in very different contexts, countries, and cultures. When we talk about TFGBV, as we said before, it manifests in so many different forms. And what forms of TFGBV or what manifestations do you see a lot in the context that you work in? And why do you think those forms are prevalent there? What about that culture or that community or even the law contributes to these manifestations and amplifies those manifestations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to a degree we see almost all the manifestations happening everywhere, unfortunately. But what we do see are narratives that draw on sort of local traditional norms, gender norms, and kind of local kind of historical context or political context. So for example, in Guatemala, one of the issues that people think about is content moderation to try to kind of limit the impact or the reach of TFGBV. So in Guatemala, there was some amount of content moderation into the election that happened last year in Spanish, and in theory should have been able to catch all of it. But a lot of the narratives that are really toxic and abusive there use kind of locally coded language that refers back to historical events, relatively recent historical events in Guatemala, including the 36-year Civil War. And so you get those very localized narratives and impacts that are not necessarily seen to outsiders or kind of global monitors who might speak the language but might not know the local context. Another phenomenon that we see is gender disinformation, where, especially involving women in politics and public life, right, that political groups, often external foreign actors, but not always, but often will engage in producing and disseminating, really abusive content. Often, it might include what they call deep fakes, right? So doctored videos or images, or sometimes audio, to harass and malign women in politics and public life. It's often women in politics for gender disinformation, and sort of accusing them of, in a variety of ways, being bad women, right? Being sort of bad women because maybe they're divorced, or maybe they're working when they are mothers, or maybe they're not mothers and that makes them bad women, or right, whatever those sort of local gendered norms are, that gets deployed not only with the goal of attacking that woman, but with the goal of attacking that entire political idea. And we definitely see that. Guatemala has the twist that there are local sort of homegrown gender disinformation farms, but we see that happening from foreign actors as well, all over the world, which is, of course, really terrible.
Judy, do you want to add from the African context?
Absolutely, absolutely. And similarly, like in other areas of the world, I think particularly in Kenya and also Africa, we have seen, I would say, especially during the political periods or even electioneering periods, we see an uptick of TFGBV, and this is usually targeted at women candidates. Again, it's always also using a gendered stereotype where you will find some political rivals actually incentivizing trolls or even just perpetrators to be able to either attack their rivals or even cybermob their their social media pages, because social media has really, really been a useful tool, and also majority of the young people and also older persons are more and more using social media in Kenya with the improved internet connectivity and access to the digital space. So we have observed a very high uptick of electoral sexual gender-based violence and also tech-facilitated gender-based violence, in particularly during the election period. And women aspirants are often meted with the sexist and gendered remarks or even harassment online. And another form that has been evolving quickly is doxing, which is very, very harmful. And it's, again, like I mentioned earlier, meant to cause additional harm in the physical space to either targeted individuals or women in public life. This could be also journalists and women activists. And the doxing itself comes as a result of either taking a public opinion or taking a side on a public opinion, or also choosing not to speak or even stay silent on an opinion when it's being a matter of public discourse. We have seen also a lot of sextortion, particularly not only for women leaders, but also for young and aspiring leaders, women leaders in tertiary institutions, also emerging or even women who are seeking to vie for office, and some journalists as well. There's a lot of sextortion that also occurs to just attack either their physical appearance or even threaten them with image-based abuse, to release non-consensual sharing images or even deep fakes of them. And this is primarily meant to either just make them or dissuade them from vying for positions or where they are able to make decisions. And altogether, it impacts how they engage online. Another very critical way that we have seen TFGBV manifesting in Kenya is also just altogether cyber mobbing, where, for instance, someone may, or even a woman in politics and public life may have their page, their social media pages, or even their platforms, or any public element that they are using to speak, just being mobbed by trolls, or if they have a hashtag, for instance, it's a feminist movement or an activity that is being planned online. We have observed that sometimes there's a lot of instances of cyber mobbing aimed at either discrediting the whole movement together, and of course spewing negative attitudes and negative norms, I would say. I would mention for one, on our X space, there's usually this page. Nobody knows who sponsored that page, but it's called Masculinity Saturday. And it just spews this toxic masculinity ideas of what it means to be a man. And most of them, of course, are demeaning of women. And I mean, it's been a worrisome trend, and it's been happening for the longest time. Nobody knows who sponsors that trendy hashtag, but it is problematic, because you often see, as a result of that continued engagement, whenever other social media users are using the platform, you will find that they always tag that toxic masculinity app. So that's just a summary of some of the ways we are seeing it manifesting, and it is problematic as well.
I just thought how Masculinity Monday makes more sense, but Masculinity Saturday, I guess if they're free on the weekend to perpetuate violence, that's fine. It really reflects what you said, really reflects with what we've been seeing so far in Central and South Asia. A couple of things that we've noticed here, in addition to what you said, is from the people we've spoken to on the ground so far, they've told us that there's a lot of re-victimization of GBV victims and survivors online. So shaming people in the cases of sexual violence or some kind of political violence, making memes, that seems to be a huge concern. And another thing that we are closely working on, and we're hoping to, expand the work that we do on this, is a lot of the TFGBV work globally focuses quite a bit on visible forms of TFGBV, or things that are visible on visible platforms like Facebook or Twitter, X. But what about platforms like Telegram or Discord or WhatsApp, where we don't always know what's going on, and sometimes you might be violated and you don't even know about it? And we've seen things like gender disinformation, Rachel, or even, non-consensual intimate image sharing happen a lot on these closed platforms. And as Christine correctly said, we are working with a group of people called digital community stewards, who are admins and moderators of various social media groups. So they have access to these pockets of online spaces. And what we're trying to do through Shri Leads is to increase their capacity and skills, because they have access to a lot of people. And when they see people spreading misinformation or hate speech within their online community, they have the power to stop it. So that's something we are excited to work with on them through this project. But yeah, as we discussed, there are a lot of problems, but we would like to also talk about the solutions, about the laws, and also about accountability. So Christine, over to you.
But before that, Darine, if I may also just add in terms of manifestations, we also do recognize that these manifestations do not only occur in social media spaces, also in the use of digital technologies, right? Like drones, GPS. And recently, in the case of Pakistan, there has been a prevalence of the use of CCTV cameras in private hostels, private women's spaces. And a lot of cases have shown that's happening in Pakistan. So some of these digital technologies are also being misused to intrude into the women's privacy, right? So that's why we also wanted to emphasize as far as TFGBV being amplified by these digital tools. And so what we also wanted to ask is that despite all of these manifestations we've seen, right, um, women are still um, hesitant, or if not fearful, of reporting these incidents. Um, so what do we see are the challenges that women face when it comes to reporting these cases? Like for instance, in Uzbekistan, we have seen the recent report in 2024 that in terms of gender assessment that there is a GBV law in Uzbekistan, but a lot of cases are still underreported. So in a way, like the GBV law has not been fully maximized because women still don't find the courage to report their experiences of abuse and harassment. So what do you see in context or in your project implementation have been the challenges that women face?
I think that's, Judy, I think that'd be great to talk about the Kenyan context there.
Absolutely. I think one of the main challenges, like you have also alluded to the Uzbekistan case. Similarly, in Kenya, there's a lot of underreporting. And this is primarily it's a twofold problem. Number one, the lack of awareness. And two, the actual lack of awareness of the existing mechanisms where survivors can get support and redress mechanisms. And I would emphasize that in Kenya, there's no direct or clear mechanisms as to how you can get support for tech-facilitated gender-based violence, although there are reporting mechanisms for online harassment, online abuse, cyber harassment. But the problem is that it's lacking in terms of implementation, because we also have quite strong laws regarding cybersecurity, data protection, and also GBV laws, but then the actual implementation and adaptation to ensure that there's a working or an effective referral pathway for TFGBV is still lacking. So I think it kind of also dissuades survivors from seeking help, because they will either look to a case that has been done before and recognize that the matter was either settled out of court or it didn't make much progress. So again, it makes them not want to report, or also altogether dismiss the case. There's also an aspect we observed of women in politics and public life also fearing reputational harm, in as much as they have access to good health services, to good psychosocial support services. But we're finding that some choose to either not receive or even seek support due to fear of reputational harm. And it is detrimental to them because they will altogether, again, either censure themselves completely or even choose to take a backside rather than be on a public-facing role. The issue of online platforms has also been a very controversial trend, particularly in Kenya. And we observe that most of the social media platforms in Kenya, they usually deploy either the content moderation or the lexicons of terms that are used to detect harm are usually in English, yet Kenya is a country where we have over 45 local languages and dialects, and people engage online in their various languages. So for social media platforms not to deploy content moderation lexicons in the local languages where people are engaging in, I mean, it sort of waters down the kind of harm that someone would report. Yes, the community guidelines may be translated into either Swahili or just exclusively Swahili, but then the actual content moderation or the time that it takes to address an issue is quite long. I recently attended an oversight meeting for one of the social media platforms, and it was, to be honest, it was worrisome to see how some of the cases that you may report, they take quite a long time because of the bureaucratic nature of the response, to a minimum of about 90 days for a decision to be made whether content is harmful enough to be taken down from social media platforms. So you can imagine the kind of harm that again, most of the survivors may or may not know where to seek help. And the other issue that is somewhat impacting the nature of redress is also the siloed approach, whereby we have various civil society organizations or even organizations offering different services, having that would work for all, and where we could either share resources and create an effective referral pathway to address these issues. So those are just, in some of the issues that we are seeing in the Kenyan and African context. Yes.
And just as we get towards the end of our webinar, one of the
So we agree that that is crucially important. And also it can be a challenge because it is perceived as a women's problem, right? And so men often feel like it's not their responsibility, or they might feel that they don't know how to engage productively. And that's something that we see across sort of women's rights or women's participation issues, that even men who are allies don't necessarily feel confident in sort of supporting appropriately. Some of the things that we've tried to do, we've reached out a lot to civic tech organizations. And I think Judy can comment a bit more about that, because our program in Kenya has been very close, very engaged with civic tech organizations, which tend to be led by men. We also are doing or launching, I think yesterday launched, a bystander campaign in Guatemala, which is a social media campaign. And so it just launched. We don't know yet how successful it will be. We hope that it will be successful in encouraging men and everyone to, refrain from sharing abusive content and those sorts of concerns. We've talked a lot about gender disinformation and people who are creating this abusive content. We've talked less about the people who might be our neighbors or friends who share content that is abusive because maybe they think it's funny, or maybe they agree with it, or maybe they're shocked by it, or all the various reasons why someone might share a really troubling or abusive meme or other sort of content online. Transform has not had the opportunity thus far to really kind of focus on that behavior, but it is something that I think needs to be focused on, is how to change that social norm that people think it's okay to share this kind of content. So Judy, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the work you've done.
Absolutely. And I think the key to that is also engaging men as allies. Also just looking at them as not only on the side of perpetration, but also as allies, because if they are the ones occupying decision-making spots or spaces, for instance, in the civic tech space, we try and create awareness and also highlight and spotlight TFGBV, because we have noted, for instance, in the tech space where we intentionally immerse ourselves as transform in the tech spaces to be able to raise awareness about TFGBV, which to our surprise or not, most of the time it came as a shock. Like most people are like, this is not a priority. We have never really thought about that. But then more and more they are becoming aware. They have this awareness of using or even deploying their tech in a gendered way, in a gendered manner, using a gendered lens, and also deploying risk mitigation measures, because the more and more we're seeing tech being deployed with just, let's just launch it and then we'll mitigate risk later. But if we create awareness and we are able to make them understand some of the impacts or some of the harms that can be caused not only on the digital space, but by some of the tools that they are creating, then they are able to also be aware that perhaps they need to loop in, either increase more women in decision-making in tech, and also either consult individuals who are in the space or CSOs working to see whether they can be able to address these biases or even highlight some of the problems that are being caused. Also, leveraging male allyship in positions of either duty bearers who are able to move the agenda, or also ensure that TFGBV and other online harms are prioritized, is one of the strategies that has worked for us. And we have continued to see more and more goodwill and commitment from the stakeholders that we are working with. Although they may be male dominated, now we are seeing them have this approach where they either want to learn more or see how they can plug in or prioritize TFGBV and other issues in their areas of work, and to ensure that it is addressed holistically, not just as a woman's problem, but an everybody problem. Yeah. Back to you, Christine. Yeah.
Go ahead, Tarini.
All right. I mean, we could talk about this forever. I know I can. But one important thing, and the kind of the burning question we wanted to end this with, considering that you've been working on this for a while, with Transform, and we are just starting out, which she leads. One of the things that we really want to know is all of these things that you talked about and all of these stakeholders who are involved. It's not easy to work with all of them because they have their own priorities and they have their own interest in terms of why they want to work on TFGBV. And Judy, you said at the very beginning that, multifaceted problems need multifaceted solutions and approaches. But how do we do that? Bringing in all of these people, the state, the tech sector, civil society, and then even the affected groups. What challenges do you face when working with all of these, different people, the dynamics? And what advice would you give to us in terms of moving forward? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. I'll chime in and also welcome Rachel to contribute as well. But I think one of the main strategy that has worked well for Transform, I would say, is to first create awareness, because these entities or all these stakeholders, they may or may not be aware of the issue, and having either capacity strengthening or just awareness creation sessions or trainings or just sit downs, and you're able to spotlight TFGBV in their various areas of work or sessions or conferences that they work in, areas where you can be able to plug in and make them see or even understand the scope or the nature of TFGBV and how it's perpetrated and how it's a multi-sectoral issue would be one way. And that would also enhance their capacity and their goodwill to be able to act accordingly. And this will also prompt questions of what can we do about it and how can we do this? This is where now we can make recommendations based off of in-depth research to be able to make sure that we are having enough evidence for action, for advocacy, for actually redressing TFGBV. And by also having knowledge gaps or policy gaps, we are able to spotlight these by either, sharing as much information as possible and having them be participants in the process, not just doing something excluding various stakeholders, but reaching out and ensuring that you're involving the various stakeholders in your engagement. Now, we do understand that this could be difficult depending on the context, but if it is possible, if there are avenues that programs can explore where they have this multi-stakeholder representatives participate, be it in either policy review or advocacy deep dives, to somewhat unpack the problem and see how does it impact individuals from a systemic level, and have them co-create solutions based on their experiences, based on their areas of work and also expertise. And then you would have now a process that they own, a process that has community support and also duty bearer support and tech company support. Then you're also able to keep track and also highlight where there might be gaps. And this is a strategy that continues to work for us, and we continue to test it, as Rachel shared earlier, and we aim to see some of the results and document some of the successes on the strategies that we have deployed. So I would say having them engaged from the get-go, even if it's when you're co-creating solutions for the program, for the launch, and all the steps that you would take to introduce TFGBV, make sure that they understand where they have questions, and also contextualizing your product to ensure that it's not like a foreign concept, but it's something that they understand and they are able to create solutions based off of their context, their expertise and resources. So that's one strategy. Yeah. Rachel?
Yeah, I would absolutely, I agree with that. And I would just add that but Transform has, I think, the luxury of supporting a number of local innovations in all the countries where we're working. And, we are still, those innovations are in progress, and we don't yet know which ones will have the most success. But one of the things that is clear is that there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and that different strategies need to be contextualized. Different contexts will be more receptive or more likely to see success from different kinds of approaches. So we're seeing we're supporting awareness raising campaigns. We're supporting at least one organization in providing pro bono lawyers to support potential cases. We're seeing a lot of need for psychosocial support for women and girls. Other kinds of kind of women empowerment programs, and also just this, sort of capacity building and awareness raising with all kinds of different stakeholders. So, and digital campaigns as well. So, maybe if you have us back in a year, we might have a lot more sort of concrete recommendations, but those are things that we're seeing that we think are really promising. And just the clear need to be really contextual. And as Judy says, to get everyone engaged early and get everyone kind of on board. So
we
Absolutely.
would love to have you back in a year.
Yeah, sure. And we're not also leaving behind technology, because we are also leveraging and testing if we could use tools or AI tools to prevent and mitigate TFGBV. So it's part of our learning. Yeah.
And just some key takeaways from my side before Darini helps us to wrap up the webinar. I really like this idea of co-creating solutions. It's really a great process. I also know that it's not easy to co-create. It takes time. It's time consuming. It's energy consuming, but it is an effective and sustainable process. And for She Leads, like the last several months that we've been implementing this project. We have just started. It was a lot of co-creation until now that we have mobilized our digital community stewards um, and and contextualizing also the solutions and the processes. And again, that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of discussions, a lot of conversations. But we are doing it. It's not an easy journey, but we are going through it because it's critical for us to have a local understanding of the nuances of TFGBV in order to find better solutions. I like the idea of calling your initiatives as innovations because they are. For the Sheily's project, we will also be implementing initiatives through our local CSOs. And we are still going to see how they envision the solutions, uh, hopefully innovative and creative solutions. And we will also look into how this will evolve over time and what best practices that could come out of it. My final takeaway also is that because technology is rapidly evolving, I feel like all of us who are deeply and directly involved in this type of work, we also need to be agile and to quickly adapt. One of the reflections that Darine has shared in one of our previous conversations was that 2 years ago they were talking about digital violence, forms of GBV, and they looked differently 2 years ago than it is now. So we may have developed training manuals, toolkits 2 years ago, but they may not, they have to be updated because technology just evolves really fast, and so we need to catch up. And so that's why it's important to have conversations like this because we need to elevate awareness, our awareness, and to continue to find solutions and innovations to catch up on the both the positive and the negative effects or impact of technology. So, Darini?
Thanks so much, Christine. And just to add to that and to wrap this conversation up, I think this particular discussion that we had is very valuable because what we often see is people talking about TFGBV, what is it, how does it happen, and all of that. But in addition to that, we spoke about what do we do about it, like in our context, in our programs. Because everybody knows, as we discussed, it's a problem, it's out there, but it's also good to let people know, don't worry, we are working on it. We are trying to make it better. So I'm really glad that we not only discuss the problems, but what are we doing to address it? Who is involved? What are they doing? And how do we make it better? I'm really glad this conversation happened, and I hope that it'll reach the right people and give them both hope and inspiration. And secondly, as Judy also pointed out, one of the key things that we're trying to do is keep our stakeholders informed because we don't want these conversations to happen in silos or this knowledge to be limited to the people who are only working on it. So as a part of that, this webinar would be, disseminated to our partners, our digital community stewards, and it will be publicly available as well. So thank you so much for contributing to it. And we hope that in the future webinars that we'll be able to unpack some of these specific topics that we really need to dwell into. So thank you so much, Judy and Rachel. And yeah, we hope to talk to you again in a year when we have more findings and successful stories to share.
Thank you. It's great to talk with you today.
Absolutely. We've enjoyed the conversation and we wish you all the best. Looking forward to our next engagement. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.